But I would like now to introduce Dr. James Wall. Dr. Wall is our speaker for today and is Associate Professor of Pediatric General Surgery. He will be talking about biodesign, overcoming challenges of maternal and fetal innovation. Dr. Wall did his undergraduate studies at Tulane University, got a bachelor's in biomedical engineering. He then went to medical school at the University of Pennsylvania and an internship and residency in Peds General Surgery at UCSF. He then went on to a fellowship in endoscopic and bariatric surgery in Strasbourg, France, before completing a fellowship in pediatric surgery at Stanford. Dr. Wall specializes in minimally invasive approaches to children's surgery. He is a physician entrepreneur who has developed multiple health technologies from idea to commercialization. Dr. Wall is currently a director of the Stanford Biodesign Innovation and Policy Fellowships, as well as co-director of the UCSF Stanford Pediatric Device Consortium. The programs that he leads at Stanford are responsible for the development of health technologies that benefit patients globally. Dr. Wall is passionate about building sustainable businesses that address the needs of the underserved patients in the pediatric, maternal, and fetal population, and is a very active surgical participant with our team on the fetal therapy program. He has 3 U.S. patents, as well as nearly 70 peer-reviewed publications and 20 book chapters. However, I would say that his proudest achievement is, as you can see here on the right, the bass guitarist and vocalist for the band Midnight Rounds, and this is from our show this Friday at the Guild Theater. So James, it's all yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Yasser, and thank you so much for the opportunity to meet with this group. I see some familiar faces, but a lot of new names, and always exciting to meet new colleagues and faculty members, especially in such a close adjacent division. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. Let's make sure it works. Get past the technical difficulty section of the day. And hopefully we should be in full view mode there. Can you see that okay, Yasser and everybody?
Yep.
Awesome, great. So yeah, I'm just gonna share a little bit today about what really began, frankly, as me tinkering in my lab with a little bit of training that I'll talk about in innovation entrepreneurship, and has now become an initiative within the Stanford Bayer Center for Biodesign that we're calling Impact One. And the idea is having an impact from day one of pregnancy, day one of gestation, day one of life. So really focusing on pediatric, maternal, and fetal patient populations who are classically underserved, and we'll show some data. And really what we're looking to do is develop health technologies through the innovation process to really transform lifetimes. So we have to start by acknowledging that there is a shocking inequity between pediatric, fetal, maternal devices, technologies, digital devices, diagnostics versus similar technologies that are made for the adult marketplace. This is really one of my favorite examples, and one that you all will probably be familiar with. You see here, central line, no big deal, nice little clever securement mechanism, sterile covering, and then you walk into our NICU, and the best we can do in a premature immunocompromised baby that you've just handed off to us is to construct an arts and crafts project out of non-sterile tape, and that's how we secure central lines. So, this isn't an anecdote, but I think if you kind of step back from your daily practice and really just sort of observe and really think about what you see in an adult operating room versus peds, adult versus OB, I think you really will start to see this pattern that we almost, I took this for granted. I walked around the NICU and didn't notice this until an engineer came in and pointed it out to me, that it seemed rather shocking. And with eyes open, we now see this on a regular basis. That's, of course, an anecdote. Here's some data to back it up in the PEDS world. I'm working on, in conjunction with Yair Blumenfeld, who's graciously volunteering some time to work with us in this program, developing similar data for maternal and fetal. But when you look at devices from publicly released data from the FDA from the 2008 to 2016 range, and you look at devices that were specifically developed, designed, and tested for children, who are 25% of the population, you see that compared to robust growth here in adult devices over that time span, general increase in indications and devices being approved by the FDA. For pediatrics, it was essentially a flat line with 1 year not even having any pediatric specific devices approved. I can almost guarantee for fetal, it may be zero. If one, but I would hazard to guess you can count it on either 0 or 1 fingers. And maternal, I'm thinking, is probably somewhere in between, and that's data that we're going to develop as we broaden the program. Why is this? There's a number of reasons, but there certainly is an underinvestment. This is data from PitchBook, which looks at investments in health technologies. You can see here, again, despite PEDS being 25% of the population, they consistently garner 5 to 8% of investments. And when you break this down even further, when you look, this is 23 investments that were made in companies that had pediatric indications. Of the 23, 18 were actually a combo, adult and pediatric. Now, to be fair to these companies, they did do pediatric specific studies to get labeling indications. But only 5 of these investments over a 3-year period, these are seed stage investments in the US, medical devices, not drugs, were really made for things that were developed specifically for children. So what are we trying to do about it? And who are we to do anything about it? One of the hats that I've mentioned is running the fellowship for both innovation and policy at the Stanford Bayer Center for Biodesign. For those of you not familiar with Biodesign, we are a program that focuses on innovation in health technology. We really have a mission to improve health outcomes and health equity through 3 major focuses. One is innovation education. That's the fellowship that I run, as well as faculty courses and undergraduate courses, through translational programs where we have specific seed stage funding through Coulter and neuroscience and others that we use to foster the development of technologies within the walls of Stanford that can then potentially scale and grow outside the walls. And more recently through health policy, which is a new area for us where we've recently recruited some great people. So the core of what we do, though, is really innovation education. We've been doing that for 20 years. Over those 20 years, we've taught a repeatable process of healthcare innovation. Starts with identifying unmet clinical needs, as you saw in that first picture, of securement of umbilical lines. Our fellows are multidisciplinary teams of clinicians, engineers, and people with business experience. They come together. They gain access to the Stanford healthcare system. Many of you may have seen them rotating through OB. I believe it was 3 years ago or 4 years ago that we were in OBGYN. Those teams then identify unmet needs, rank opportunities, try and match technologies, and then try and build implementation plans that can get those technologies to patients. So within that center, we're of course across all of healthcare. I'm going to focus from here on what we're really trying to do to raise up pediatric, maternal, and fetal and make it a larger part of this program. You see in the bottom right here, the program is very proud of the number of patients that our technologies have touched over the years. It's now actually pushing over 8 million. This is last year's slide, I apologize. But not enough of those have been pediatric and maternal. And so we really need to improve. There are real challenges in these marketplaces. The fundamental challenge is, how do we develop high impact technologies for relatively small markets? The market size is somewhat fixed. There's 4 million-ish births a year. There's 25% of the population is pediatric, but they tend to be healthy and diseases are more rare. So you can't really change that, but you can address some of these other fundamental challenges. How do you find alternative funding, non-dilutive funding, meet the technical challenges of scaling down your technology for small children, fetuses, dealing with growth. Regulatory is something we've addressed directly with the FDA and really have partnered with them to try and minimize friction on that side. And when you get into the teenage years, privacy. So there's all kinds of challenges, but ones that we think are worth facing. We take the Biodesign approach to planning out these technologies and really doing as much diligence as we can upfront on opportunities and technologies before investing a lot of time to really try and ensure that we have success when technologies get out to patients, that they make an impact, that they deliver the outcomes that we want. I'm going to specifically talk to the story of a company what is now a company called Novinate, that started out as a lab project to solve that first unmet clinical need that you saw of umbilical catheter securement. We had a group of students who brought that to me. I said, pretty small market, 200,000 umbilical catheters placed a year. That's, peanuts compared to diabetes. Not sure people are going to be willing to pay for this solution. Not sure we're going to be able to show difference in infections. We did more and more diligence. Realized that line migrations were probably 50% in umbilical catheters and causing catheters to be removed prematurely. So we took additional steps to say, can we secure lines in a better fashion? So you can see here, we did a bunch of prototyping, a bunch of mechanical testing within the walls of Stanford based off of grant funding. We then did biologic testing where you all were kind enough to let us use umbilical cords, which you keep for 24 hours, as we learned after birth, I believe it's to swab them in case of maternal or infant fever. And so before discard, we were using those to do biologic testing and determine ventilation. It's not a particularly hard design problem, but it has to be designed specifically for the neonate. You can't, of course, use stat locks or other things that are used for adult central lines. We had to design something that could hold a catheter at 90 degrees. And then ultimately the IP was around work that we did to determine how much ventilation was required throughout the device in order to allow the umbilical cord to desiccate naturally. Because if you completely cover it, it becomes, as you can imagine, a greenhouse for increased bacterial growth and the potential for increased infection. So prototyping, mechanical, biological work done at Stanford. And then to the left, you see a lot of user interface and user testing with the nurses, who we all know in the NICU are really critical to making these decisions. And we wanted to make sure that it fit in with their workflow and was something that they wanted to use. Here you can see the actual testing in action, all done on campus using very limited resources in a very capital efficient manner. And ultimately, the story here is that with about $100,000 in grant funding, a lot of sweat and effort, we were able to develop something that was really low risk in that we had completely developed the device, determined all these operating factors about it. We're really almost ready to manufacture it and had customers who are ready to pay for it, at which point, being a small market is the only really risk left. And we were able to get private investment, turn it into a very small capital efficient company. It's now been on over 3,000 babies. It's generating revenue, and they're in discussions to become part of a larger organization that would really scale the ability to get this solution out to NICUs around the country. It is standard of care at Stanford now. You'll see it if you're in the NICU. And the initial clinical data was really astounding, showing 73% reduction in line migrations with really a very simple solution. So I hope that, it's not easy. This took 8 years. I don't want to make it sound like it was like, snap your fingers and happens, but it was, it followed this Biodesign process. It really looked for an unmet need, a clinical outcome that we could have an effect on, and really driving value. I want to make the point that lightning didn't kind of strike once. This has happened a few times with faculty members who have been supported through the Biodesign program. Dr. Janine Furch, one of our neonatologists, who I'm sure you know, identified the unmet need of unwanted pregnancies while on oral contraception, something I'm sure very familiar to this group, and really targeted the teen and millennial generation with a smart pill box, but really designed in a way of digital engagement for someone who wants to take a medication, as opposed to all the smart boxes that are multiple medications for people who don't want to take it and aren't digitally native. So they really identified a great patient population. They got a prototype out and were ultimately acquired after raising some venture capital money, and that's now being scaled by another company. Another example, 2EO Health, which was developed by Dr. Bronwyn Harris, one of our pediatric cardiologists. She saw asthma monitoring at home being a piece of paper that was just not utilized because really difficult for parents to use it. This was kind of the symptom checker that pediatricians classically use to see if patients were developing worsening asthma and really trying to identify when they should be given a dose of steroids to prevent hospitalization. Really just not an effective tool. So they developed a combination of a sensor in the bed, which looked at respirations. It brought in data on pollen in the air and other contributing factors, and then allowed parents to track symptoms in a really simple fashion. They showed the ability with this system to decrease hospitalizations in a clinical trial, and they were acquired by Apple, who is very interested in sleep, but we don't know what they're going to do with this. So hopefully you can see that, by using kind of a really systematic approach to innovation, great opportunities can be identified, nice technologies can be matched, and they can go on. It's not about building companies, and frankly, nobody's getting rich off these. These are small amounts of money in, a little bit bigger amounts of money out. But really, it's about scale, right? You have to get to that commercial level for it to get beyond the walls of Stanford, to get out to other NICUs, to other obstetric practices, to patients. And so, all of these are now touching more patients than we could ever see individually as clinicians. Works globally as well, just as for anyone who has an interest in global health. We have a collaboration with a number of biodesign programs that we've helped start around the world. India being our most mature, that's been going on for about 10 years now. We also have programs in Singapore, Ireland. We're standing up a program in East Africa next year. But this is a great invention that we've come up with in Palo Alto. The concept here was the need for a provider to be able to provide neonatal resuscitation single-handed and without electricity. Two constraints we would never consider in our NICU, because there's 400 people that show up for every resuscitation, and 8 ventilators available. So in this case, the idea was to keep a hand free, so all the ventilation and no electricity. So all the ventilation is done with a foot pump. When the foot pump comes up, it also provides suction so that the provider can have a single hand to mask, foot to create ventilation, and another hand to either do CPR or whatever else needs to be done. So just making the point that, with different constraints, different markets, you can apply this process and come up with great solutions. I'm going to point out something that we are really fun. So that's kind of what we do internally within the program. I will point out we also have some fellows who you might see around the hospital who work with us, really focused on peds and maternal. We're hoping to get additional grant funding. We're currently funded by the FDA, Cottrell Foundation, and some philanthropic funds that allow us to do this work internally at Stanford. And our FDA funding also allows us to do some external funding. So we have the ability to support projects, some within Stanford, but also outside. So they can come from Caltech. They can frankly come from anywhere within the US, Texas, Boston, doesn't matter. If it's a good project that meets, that is a great opportunity to impact children, moms, or fetuses, then we're able to support it. So we have 3 tiers of support. We do an innovators forum every month where projects come in. They pitch everything from a physician and an idea all the way up to a mature company that has a device that they may want to get a pediatric indication for. We provide 3 levels of support for kind of that idea and physician level. We provide really mostly coaching, biodesign training, making sure that people flesh out the value proposition and understand the barriers that they would face as they would try to take this forward, the kind of capital they would need to do it, kind of testing they would need to get through the FDA, et cetera. Our second tier of support is directed resources, where we have access to consultants, prototyping shops, a lot of the basic building blocks of an early stage product where you want to do prototyping and get an opinion on what your FDA path is going to be, how you might get paid, et cetera. And then finally, we have a pitch competition annually. We've been doing that for 4 years now. We're now up to, we have the ability to give away almost $500,000 in seed funding at that pitch competition, again, both internally and externally. And those seed grants that we've given, you can see over on the right, have gone on to develop all the way up to commercialization. This small amount of seed money, when you pick projects with a lot of opportunity, have been, the seed funding has been impactful. Those companies and projects have gone on to raise an additional $40+ million in capital to continue to develop their technologies to get to patients. And ultimately, they've touched almost 20,000 patients at this point. That's nowhere near the 8 million of, that Biodesign's done in 20 years, but for our first 4 years, we're really proud of this, and we really want this to grow. And we'd really love to see it grow more on the maternal side with more collaboration between our departments, our groups. Couple of examples of pipeline projects which are strong. This is Yair's involved in this one, along with Dr. Kuhn Scheth, who's one of our pediatric urologists, came to us from Texas. You know this, you've seen this ultrasound before, I don't have to explain it to you. Ludo is a devastating fetal anomaly, highly lethal. As you all know, there are some patients in which there may be benefit to shunting. I'll acknowledge there's a lot of nuance and subtlety around renal development, but early shunting has some promise. The problem is the shunts are absolutely useless. Even Dr. Harrison, who's a good friend and colleague and my co-PI on the FDA grant we have, will admit that he really just he was forced to kind of adapt by, I think it was Cook that helped him develop this. Really, they just took their double J stent and said, well, let's just kind of adapt it, and we're not going to really build anything custom here. Hopefully it'll work. And, it kind of does the trick, but as you all know, there's a significant amount of dislodgement. The shunts come out. Sorry, I thought there was a picture here of Yair with one of his patients in another presentation. I must have cut it short here, but a patient that Yair had, who I think they ended up doing 4 or 5 of these shunts just to try and keep the bladder decompressed. So the team here really took, again, a specific design approach. It's a daunting development project because it's only, potentially a couple thousand, maybe not even, maybe high hundreds to low thousand number of patients per year. But they really decided to go for something really built and designed for this indication, not just adapting a double J stent. And what they've done here is build what they call the Vortex shunt. They've deployed this so far in fetal lambs, and they've done a lot of bench testing. But the idea here is that they have nitinol braided, very similar to the occluder technology, for, sort of inspired by pediatric cardiology, the septal occluder. So the nitinol can fold up nicely into a sheath and be delivered through a small French sheath, 6 French or something, maybe even less. And then very, very unique design here with the shaft that has a spring system that can kind of grow. So these anchor the shunt in the abdominal wall so that it doesn't move out. And the spring has got a coefficient of, it's not coefficient of friction, but I think you understand what I'm saying, that allows it to kind of easily grow with the baby and stay in place. They've also developed some IP around a one-way valve that would allow the bladder to potentially cycle. Unclear if that would add anything to renal development, but there's some early data in animals that maybe cycling the bladder would be the best option here, not to have it completely decompressed. Another example in the pipeline of an external project, so that's internal, Yair, Dr. Sheath, a whole team that's working on it internally. Externally, we've supported this project. Again, I'm not going to tell you all what this is. This is clearly fetal heart rate monitoring. There's lots of issues around it. I think we can all acknowledge. I know there's a lot of nuance that I don't understand, and you do. But really what this group is doing, this is an anesthesiologist out of Sacramento, is developing a system for fetal pulse oximetry that can be done non-invasively. It uses similar light waves to standard pulse oximetry. They obviously have to go deeper to gain the fetal signal. It's a low signal compared to mom, so there's a lot of algorithms back that done to figure out the signal from the baby, and of course, plus fetal hemoglobin. But long story short, they have got really compelling data that they're able to accurately track oxygenation, and they've received breakthrough status from the FDA, and they're really close to clinical use of this device. So, we'll see where it goes. They're, like most innovators, they're fairly optimistic about their sensitivity specificity, but they do have data to back this up. And I think it would be exciting if we could really go from what I understand, and again, I'm not going to teach you about it, but my understanding of the challenges around interpretation of fetal heart rate monitoring versus maybe some more clarity or another signal that can be helpful in terms of fetal oxygenation. So we were really proud to support this group. They've gone on to raise a significant amount of money, and I'm hoping they'll be on the market soon. So I'll just kind of sum up with kind of the main things that we do to support this ecosystem. It really starts with that innovation education that I talked about. With our funding, we're able to train one biodesign fellow a year with pediatric or maternal background. So one ask of this group is if you have any residence fellows or people who come to Stanford with an interest in technology development, please send them our way for even before they're interested in the program, to discuss, what the program's all about, whether they would fit in as a fellow or in one of our graduate classes, et cetera. We have this fellowship that I spoke about where we were able to support a postdoc in spending time in the different strategic areas of Packard. Last year, we had a fellow spend time in the Johnson Center. She developed a bunch of needs around, including some in obstetrics, although her top need ended up being in the neonatal ICU, really looking at the detection of necrotizing enterocolitis, which you all know is a devastating disease that we often have to deal with as surgeons. She leveraged some data from the 80s that was able to show there's unique gases that are released by bacteria that in ordinary bowel wouldn't exist. And if you can pick up that small signal early as bacteria is translocating through the wall, there's a potential to be able to stop feeds, initiate antibiotic therapy. The data from the 80s was somewhat positive, but the technology wasn't there. We're now collaborating with someone in material science who does measurement of gases for the oil and gas industry and is able to, deliver really super sensitive small parts per million gas monitoring for that industry, and we're trying to apply that to this indication. And so far, we're already in clinical studies, taking samples from the NICU and hoping to see if we can take this all the way to the market. Finally, I just make a mention to the fact that we are, very interested in policy. It's a newer area for biodesign, but something that's super important. You can see here, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar, but when it comes to biopharma and drugs, there's been a fair amount of legislation and policy really focused on trying to develop those therapeutics for orphan indications and for rare diseases. And combination of the Orphan Drug Act, PREA, and a few others put in place both carrots, incentives, vouchers that give you extended IP coverage, et cetera, and then sticks in terms of requiring drug companies to do pediatric testing. It's really, you can see, increase the number and the availability of drugs for rare diseases. I will also point out that drugs don't have the same pricing pressure as devices, so there's probably a contributing factor that drug pricing is fairly elastic and based on demand. And so anyway, a combination of those factors, you've seen great increase in the treatment of rare diseases and orphan diseases with drugs, but you don't see it on the device side. And we'd like to start generating the data and policy recommendations that could lead to improved regulatory environment, payment environment that leads to more innovations, more, that original chart we went back to, more devices that come out with indications for kids, for moms, for fetuses. So the program's growing. We are really excited, super excited to have Yair kind of dipping his toes in the water and trying to help us out, and particularly helping us as we evaluate external teams that are trying to innovate in maternal fetal medicine. Would also love to support internally anybody in the group who has thoughts, ideas. This is, we're not here to take them and run with them. We don't have an engineering team that can do everything, but we certainly can support people who want to be kind of active, as we call them, primary entrepreneurs as opposed to primary investigators, people who really want to take something and translate it. So with that, I'll maybe leave it for some questions. I hope that's on time. And I don't know if there's anything else you need, Yasser, but happy to take some questions from the group.
Wonderful. Yes, absolutely. And thank you, James, so much for this great lecture. It's very exciting to see you kind of lead the charge on maternal and fetal and pediatric innovations like this, because at least in obstetrics, one of the things that has really haunted us and held us back has been the exclusion of pregnant women from clinical trials, from innovation, much of it driven by fear and litigation issues. But I think it is so critical, and it has such a such impact. I in fact was going to tell you, I just got a text from one of our fellows asking who you were and how she can reach out to you, because she's really interested in this work. So awesome. James, can you say a little bit, and then I'll see if there's, and if you can help me see if there's any other people who have questions, but can you say a little bit about what it would take, for example, if one of our residents and fellows wanted to work in this sphere during training?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to get involved. There's always kind of the lowest bar to just dip your toes. We do an innovators forum once a month. Everyone from the Stanford community is welcome. So if people just want to kind of drop in, see the kind of projects that are being presented, and then occasionally there'll be someone that says, wow, that's really interesting, they can follow up, and if they want to help or get involved, that's sort of independent matchmaking. So that's kind of at the level of just kind of putting the toes in the water. I think education is really important in this area. So the options for education for residents and fellows, our graduate class is probably the lowest commitment. That's a 20-week, 2-quarter class. It's in the winter and spring, starts in January each year. It's in the evenings, so I know that even that's not conducive to most residents who are actively in training, but it's 2 evenings a week. There's students, there's residence fellows, medical students, there's MBA students, and there's graduate engineering students. We put them in innovation teams, run them through the biodesign process, teach all the fundamentals of identifying unmet needs, ranking opportunities, putting together an implementation plan. And there's been some real projects and even some companies that have come out of that. Not that that's the end goal, but again, if you want to get something to patients, you got to have some mechanism to get there. And usually startup licensing, you got to get it to some point. So that's another way to get involved. And then ultimately, people who are really interested in this, we have our 1-year fellowship. It's actually 10.5 months. For some residencies and fellowships that can give people a full 10.5 months off, it can be done within the ACGME framework. We've not done that with OBGYN. I'm not sure if it's possible. It is possible with some of the PEDS fellows, but anyway, we could talk about that if it came to it. If not, you can take a year off, which is what I did as a surgery resident back in the day. I took a year off and came and did this fellowship. That's a full-time commitment. You can't be moonlighting, doing other stuff, because you've got a whole team that's depending on you. You're paired up with an engineer, someone with business background. You're given open access to the Stanford healthcare system, and then that's very rigorous, hands-on mentoring, lots of didactics, and that's really kind of the pinnacle of training for health tech innovation. And from that program, that's where many of the great innovations have come from our program. Probably the top example is iRhythm, which the Zeo patch, which you all probably know and use. Was developed out of that program about 12 years ago. Lots of examples. And I would love nothing more. I think it starts with education. I've been reasonably successful in getting more pediatric specialists interested and involved. I'd love to have more trainees from OBGYN.
Thank you so much. And one other follow-up question, just briefly, you talked about the O2-SAT fetal heart rate monitor. What does it take in terms of the process to go from one of these kind of innovations to market? I mean, isn't there a clinical trial required and other interim steps?
Oh yeah, there's a lot. I mean, that one started with, prototyping, developing the algorithm to be able to subtract mom's oxygen saturations from the babies, making sure that signal was there in an animal model with a prototype. It's non-invasive, so, they can use it on patients now. It's sort of a non-significant risk because it's not being used for decision making. It's just being compared to fetal heart rate monitoring. So there's a big trial ongoing to show that.
So there is a clinical trial for that.
Yes, correct. And ultimately, to get an indication from the FDA that makes it some sort of diagnostic modality, it has to hit certain specifications. It has to have a quality system that assures that every device that goes out the door of the company does what it says it does. There's a lot. And that's why the fellowship's a full-time 1-year commitment, is to really dig into all that planning that you need to do.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been really very fascinating and innovative, and it's just amazing that all this is right here at Stanford, and I'm so happy that you are here leading it, and hopefully you will have a stream of OBGYN trainees heading your way. So
Dr.
thank you.
Wall, would you mind sharing information about the Innovators Forum? I couldn't find it on your program website, so could you maybe just email me and so I can distribute?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy.
Join. Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining today, and look forward to seeing everyone at our next meeting. Thanks again, James.
Thanks, Yasser. Thank you, everyone.
Bye now.